Hi everyone and welcome to this lesson in which we're going to compare the poems Climbing My Grandfather by Andrew Waterhouse and Follow Up by Seamus Heaney, and we're going to look at different ways that you can compare these poems, not in response to a specific question but in response to any question which would set you one of these poems as the set poem, of course, and ask you to look at the relationships between family members, intergenerational relationships. I'm saying that, of course, because Climbing My Grandfather is not a parent-child relationship, but I can't see or predict a way in which they would ask you about relationships between a child and their grandparent specifically in the wording of the question, and that's because there aren't any other poems, of course, which deal with grandparental relationships. And so unless you're expected to do some kind of reinventing of the term, parental relationship to introduce the grandparent role as a parent, I don't think you want to do that anyway. We're going to look at them as family relationships, okay? And I think this is something that's quite possibly likely to come up because as we look back over the history of the questions which have been set on the GCSE papers on all of the years which have been going since the new version of this GCSE started and this particular anthology has started being used, most of the questions have been based around romantic relationships and those love relationships that might get you thinking about, for example, One With Two Parted or Neutral Tones or even Letters from Yorkshire. And this is there's a whole section of the anthology here which is all about family. So these aren't two obvious ones necessarily, which usually spring to mind as being very good to compare, but I'm going to suggest some ways that we can compare both of them. I like both of them, and I'm going to get that out of the way first. I like Follower. I think Follower is a good poem. I really like Climbing My Grandfather. I think it's really great, and I think it's somewhat underappreciated, this poem, and partly that's because I think it's the last poem in the anthology. In some ways it tends to get left a little bit to the end when people are working through this anthology, students and teachers alike. It gets to the end and you're a little bit tired out of the process or whatever. I think that's a shame because I think it's very good. I also like it because I'm going to look at in a moment, there is a really solid idea at the heart of Climbing My Grandfather, which looks on the surface like it's quite simple and quite straightforward, but I'm going to suggest that there is something more complex than you may possibly have first noticed. I should mention at this point a couple of things about the way this video is going to work. You'll want to have in front of you copies of these poems, and you may well wish to make some notes as you go along. I would be expecting at this point that you have already in some way at least read and thought about and studied these poems. This will not be an introduction to the two poems, so I'll assume that you already know what we're talking about. The other thing is, on my screen here, unless you've got me sort of expanded up to some huge flat screen size on your living room wall, you may not be able to see every single word that's on it. I don't really need you to. It may be that I decide to make some notes on these poems as we go. If you get the general direction of where I'm writing and you can obviously tell what line I'm referring to, then that's kind of good enough. I just think it's kind of useful to have this here anyway. So that's just some of the practical matters. So Climbing My Grandfather and Follower, how are they similar? There's a few different ways that you can compare these two. And I'm going to start with Climbing My Grandfather and this idea that I've just suggested is sort of simple but opens out to a more complex one. And it's this. The central sort of scheme of the poem, I don't mean rhyme scheme, I mean the central idea of the whole poem is usually correctly identified as being one in which a grandfather is metaphorically converted into a mountain. Of course, if you've identified that as an extended metaphor, even better, because that's what it is. And that's great and that's fabulous. And we can work out the implications of a metaphor or any kind of figurative language by exploding it out into its connotations, doing our connotation explosion. What do we associate with mountains? Well, they're big, they're old, they're sturdy, they're unchanging. There is a sense of sort of steadfastness about them. They are solid, but they're also beautiful, but in a way which is kind of craggy and cracked and gnarly and all of those things. So you'll have done the first job, which is to say that that's a really good metaphorical object to use to describe a grandparent, because the grandparent feels like they've been there forever, dependable, sturdy, timeless, ancient, and beautiful, but in this kind of craggy, weathered, weather-beaten way. That's a really good analysis of the idea of the metaphor of grandfather as mountain. Really good. But actually, that's not really the full extent of what the poem is about, is it? I've seen this described as being based upon a memory, because children like to climb up older relatives, fathers and grandfathers and mothers and grandmothers as well, fine. Yes, sure, but I don't think this is based on a memory. This is clearly has been converted through the poem into a metaphorical sort of analogy, okay? Follower, on the other hand, we might see is more realistically based on something that it's possible to remember, but this is taking place in a fantasy version of that kind of relationship. So what's this more complex idea? Well, it's this. If the grandfather is metaphorically a mountain, that's easy and that makes sense. But that's not just what the poem is about. The poem, quite obviously, because the title is directing us to it, is that the persona, Andrew Waterhouse's speaking first person persona in this poem, is climbing the mountain that is metaphorically his grandfather, which is not exactly quite as much of a simple thing. It's slightly more complicated. So if you have not thought about this now and you have not done this yet, I'll now invite you to pause this video and take a pause point just for 1 minute while you briefly thrash out and jot down some ideas about what is the meaning of the metaphor of climbing up the mountain that is my grandfather. Not what's the mountain, that's easy, but what is the climbing? So if you've had a pause there and you've come back to think about that, I'd be very interested to see what you think of this, because I think it's much less obvious where the mountain is the grandfather is the mountain. What is metaphorically the climbing process? And I'm going to suggest that in my interpretation, or a good interpretation, is that the climbing is the process of getting to know the grandfather in some way, somehow finding out or learning about or understanding or appreciating the grandfather. That's what the climbing is. And that is a slightly different thing from just saying my grandpa is old and dependable and beautiful and craggy and weather-beaten and sturdy. It's a slightly different thing, because what are the connotations of mountain climbing as opposed to the connotations just of a mountain? Well, that it's risky, it's dangerous, it's potentially life-threatening, it's very difficult, it may take you a long time, you may have to do lots of preparation. It's not something that's going to come very easily, but also it is rewarding, and there might be a sense of triumph at the end of it, particularly in the way that he decides to do this. Now, everybody has a different relationship with their family members and their grandparents. If we were in a classroom right now, it would be really nice to do this activity where I give you a list of questions, and I invite everyone to think about whether or not you know the answer to these questions in relation to your own grandfather. And I want to work with grandfathers specifically, and I'm well aware, as I say this, that not everyone is lucky enough to have all of their family members around, and I completely understand and completely appreciate that. But the reason why I'm so happy to say this is because I don't think that's irrelevant. I don't think that's an irrelevant point. Okay. And the questions would be like this: do you know what your grandfather's middle name is? Do you know where he first lived? Do you know where he was born? Do you know what his parents were called? Do you know what his first job was? Do you know what his first car was? Do you know what his dreams were? What were his ambitions? What did he want to do when he was a young man? And those sorts of questions, I'm sure that there will be some of you watching this who will be going, yeah, I know all of those things because I've got this really, really close relationship. But other people might be finding actually it's sort of more distant. And I say this, and I'm absolutely happy to share this with you. I say this as a person who has one of my grandfathers. I don't know what his name is because I don't know whether he's alive or dead. He's a person that's not been in my life at all. So even just with 2 generations in my family tree, it's got to a point where I go, I don't know about his middle name. I don't even know his first name, right? It's kind of nothing to me. So before I said, there's a thing here about, well, are we supposed to treat grandparents like their parents? Are we supposed to imagine in an exam scenario that climbing my grandfather could be compared with follower or perhaps walking away, which is about a dad, or perhaps before you were mine? And my answer is going to be, kind of, in a way, yes, if it makes a good essay, but also in a way, no, because grandparents are different. There's a kind of leapfrogging generational emotional connection there. I know lots of people who are in lots of ways more emotionally sort of committed to grandparents than they are to their own parents, in other ways not, but it's a different kind of relationship. And I think that's why Andrew Waterhouse sets out to tell us this kind of imaginary fantasy story about getting to know a person, but he quite deliberately does not choose to talk about his own parents in the way that Charles Causley talks about his parents in Eden Rock, to give just another example, or as mentioned, Before You Were Mine, when Caroline Duffy wants to find out and know more about her mum through looking at this photograph and trying to understand this image. Andrew Waterhouse wants to go further. It's a difficult process. It's a difficult thing. How do you manage it? I suspect that you'd have to put some planning in. I suspect you have to find the right moment and go and sit down with this person and say, tell me about, what you did in the war. Tell me about what your dreams were, because it may not be that obvious to everybody. So as we explore the way love is presented in this poem, I want there to have this understanding that there's that kind of sense of distance, and that this fantasy metaphorical explanation of this is really digging deep into the idea that it's not an easy relationship, and it's sort of quite a distant one. Follower, on the other hand, we've got a parent-child relationship, of course, and it's not being conveyed through this broad metaphor. It's actually very, very, very unmetaphorical. It's very, very, very prosaic, very literal, in the sense that it's bringing us to this, this moment where we can assume, although we never commit to saying poems are, specifically about an individual as opposed to a persona, there are personas which are more autobiographical than others. And if we look back at Seamus Heaney's background and his life, then we understand that there is a thread here. We feel the realism of it. I don't think that's an unfair thing to say. So there is a more realistic representation of this moment. However, the great connection between the two poems is that even though the image of the young boy walking behind his father doing the horse ploughing in Follower, even though that image may be more realistic and maybe more based on autobiographical reality, it is still a case that we can say that's a metaphor. Because that whole image is set up to be metaphorical. It absolutely is all about, literally and metaphorically, following in the father's shadow, following in his footsteps. The whole title of the poem sets us up to expect that it's not just walking physically behind someone, but what that means as you translate it into its kind of metaphorical reality. So the two positions that these poems set up make them really, really good candidates for comparing, because they're doing a similar thing through their metaphors, but the metaphors themselves are kind of wildly different. This idea about climbing the mountain, climbing the grandfather, is very interesting in the first line when the persona says, I decide to do it free, without a rope or net. You're not sure what that means, and there are some more kind of specific terms that run throughout this poem. I just watched a film just recently, which I've been really looking forward to, and it popped up on the Disney Plus channel, although it was the National Geographic section of the Disney Plus channel, and it's called Free Solo. It's a documentary about a young guy who climbs the face of a cliff face in America, and it's called El Capitan, El Cap they call it, and it is this 3,000-foot solid granite rock face, and he does it free, which means without a rope, and he climbs up this, and it's a documentary, it's absolutely astonishing. But if you have 90 minutes to spare and you want to see something really exciting, really interesting, watch that film. It's not necessarily all just going to be about providing some context for this poem, because I would suggest that if you're just looking for that, might be a bit of a waste of time. But what you get from that is a sense of why mountain climbers, why rock climbers do the things they do. And when the guy in that film speaks, you get this real sense that it's not just about going for a bit of exercise. It's about actually strapping yourself into something that pushes you so close to a sort of adrenaline fueling experience that he feels this kind of I don't know if he says it in his words, but you get this sense that he feels this kind of oneness with nature and with the universe, and it's that big a kind of cosmic sort of huge experience. And I want you to get the impression that this is not just about my grandfather equals mountain. It's about climbing and getting to know my grandfather equals this cosmic, huge, sort of awe-inspiring experience for him.